You're hungry. Not the kind of hungry where you've skipped lunch and your stomach is growling. The kind where you've been working since before sunrise and you have 4 hours left before dark, and your body is burning through everything you gave it this morning. You sit down for a meal, and you eat the same thing you ate yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. The same thing you ate last week, last month. The same thing your father ate, the same thing his father ate. The same bowl, the same flavor, the same texture, every single day for your entire life. For roughly 500 years, this wasn't poverty. This wasn't a bad harvest. This was just Tuesday. This was just eating. So, what did a medieval peasant, which is to say the vast majority of all people who ever lived in medieval Europe, actually put in their body every day? The answer is stranger, more deliberate, and more nutritionally sophisticated than almost anything you've been told. Let's start by destroying the picture you already have. When most people imagine medieval peasant food, they imagine darkness, thin gray gruel, rotten meat, disease on a plate, starvation half the year. That image comes partly from Victorian moralizing, partly from dramatized fiction, and partly from the genuine horror of famine years, which were real and catastrophic. But not the whole story. The actual evidence drawn from manor court records, monastic accounts, and the research of historian Christopher Dyer in his 2002 work, Standards of Living in the Later Middle Ages, tells a far more complicated story. One that will make you uncomfortable in ways you didn't expect. The foundation of the medieval peasant diet was pottage, not porridge, not soup. Pottage. The word matters because pottage was something that doesn't exist in modern cuisine. A thick, semi-solid mass cooked continuously in a ceramic pot suspended over the fire, added to every day, never fully emptied. You didn't make a fresh meal. You maintained a living pot. Whatever was available went in. Dried peas, oats, barley, onions, leeks, garlic, wild herbs from the hedgerows, alexanders, sorrel, nettles, ground elder. In summer, you added fresh greens. In winter, you ate what you'd preserved from autumn. The pot was never truly the same pot twice, but it was never entirely different either. It was a continuous process, not a recipe, a practice. Here's what that means nutritionally. Legumes, dried peas, and beans were the primary protein source for most of the medieval year. Christopher Dyer's analysis of peasant household accounts shows that peas and beans constituted roughly 20 to 30% of caloric intake for English peasants in the 13th and 14th centuries. Legumes combined with cereal grains produce a complete amino acid profile. Not a perfect one, but a functional one. The combination that modern nutritionists describe as complementary protein, the same principle behind rice and beans, lentils, and flatbread, was being practiced by illiterate English peasants 6 centuries before the concept had a scientific name. They didn't know why it worked. They knew that it worked because generations of people who ate it survived, and generations of people who didn't. Now complicate that picture. The church was the other ingredient in every peasant meal that never appears on the ingredients list. Under the fasting rules enforced by the medieval Catholic Church, rules that were legally binding, not optional, and that were monitored at the parish level, roughly a third of all days in the calendar year were fasting days. This included every Friday, every Saturday in some regions, the entirety of Lent, 40 days, Advent, roughly 4 weeks, and a scattering of additional vigil days tied to major saints' feasts. On fasting days, meat was forbidden. So was dairy. So were eggs. What you could eat was fish, bread, vegetables, and legumes. Barbara Harvey, in her 1993 study Living and Dying in England, 1100-1540, calculated that for Benedictine monks following the rule strictly, fasting days constituted approximately 160 days per year. For lay peasants, compliance varied, but canon law enforcement through ecclesiastical courts was real. There are documented cases of individuals presented before church courts for eating meat on a Friday. The fasting calendar wasn't spiritual flavoring added on top of peasant diet. It was structural. It controlled the rhythm of what people ate, when they ate it, and what they had to preserve, stockpile, or substitute across an entire year. The medieval peasant's relationship to food was a liturgical relationship. The calendar of fasting and feasting shaped the larder as completely as the harvest did. And here is where the picture inverts. Feast days, the other side of that calendar, were not gentle indulgences. The same church that restricted meat for 160 days a year mandated communal feasting on the roughly 50 major saints' days and holy days that punctuated the year. Eamon Duffy in The Stripping of the Altars, 1992, documents the intensity of parish feast culture in pre-Reformation England. Shared meals funded by the alewife and the churchwardens, collective consumption of food that individual households could never have produced alone. Ale was central. Judith Bennett's Ale, Beer, and Brewsters in England, 1996, establishes that ale was not a luxury or an indulgence. It was a nutritional staple brewed primarily by women, providing calories, B vitamins, and, crucially, safe hydration in environments where water sources were contaminated. A peasant adult might consume a gallon of ale a day, not to get drunk, to stay alive. So here's what a realistic day of eating looked like for an English peasant in, say, the 13th century. Before work, pottage from the pot, a piece of maslin bread, a mixture of wheat and rye, darker and denser than anything sold in a modern bakery, but more nutritionally complex than white bread, which was a luxury for the wealthy. During the working day, more bread, possibly carried into the field, eaten without stopping. In the evening, pottage again, thicker now from the day's reduction, with whatever legumes or greens the season offered. Ale throughout. Meat perhaps once or twice a week, if the household kept animals and could afford to slaughter them, or if a lord distributed portions after a hunt. On fasting days, none of the above. Bread, pottage without fat, dried fish if available. The bread itself deserves a moment. White bread, made from bolted, refined wheat flour, was a status marker in medieval England. The assize of bread, a royal price regulation first issued in 1266 and renewed repeatedly through the medieval period, legally defined different grades of bread and their permitted prices. The finest white loaf, called wastel or pain de main, was consumed by lords and wealthy merchants. The peasant ate black bread, coarse bread, bread with visible grain and husk. Bread that modern nutritionists would classify as significantly higher in fiber, minerals, and slower digesting complex carbohydrates. The hierarchy of medieval bread was an exact inversion of modern dietary knowledge. The bread that signified poverty was the bread that kept you healthier. The bread that signified wealth, white, refined, status-laden, was the bread that caused the dental decay and metabolic disruption visible in the skeletal remains of medieval elites compared to peasant populations. The poor ate the better bread. They just didn't know it, and neither did anyone else. Here's the part that should sit with you. The modern food system has reconstructed, at enormous expense and with tremendous cultural effort, many of the features that were structural defaults of the medieval peasant diet. High-fiber whole grains, legume-based protein, seasonal vegetables, fermented foods, regular periods of dietary restriction. A calendar that imposed eating patterns rather than leaving them to individual willpower and consumer choice. We call these things clean eating, plant-based diets, intermittent fasting, intuitive eating, the gut microbiome revolution. We sell them in the wellness industry for significant sums of money to people who can afford them. The medieval peasant didn't buy these things. They were simply the conditions of existence for anyone who wasn't wealthy enough to eat badly. Christopher Dyer's skeletal evidence shows that medieval English peasants in the 13th century were, on average, nutritionally comparable to modern Western populations. Not worse, in some measures better, particularly in the absence of processed sugar and refined carbohydrate. The food poverty we associate with the medieval period is real in famine years, in the aftermath of war, in periods of harvest failure. But the baseline, the ordinary Tuesday, the maintenance diet of a functioning peasant household. That diet was not nutritional darkness. It was constrained, monotonous, liturgically governed, and structurally sound. We look at the medieval peasant bowl of pottage and see deprivation. We are eating ultra-processed food in our cars between obligations and paying a premium for lentil soup at lunch.